In the 1980 presidential election, Jimmy Carter faced a really tough challenge trying to win re-election. The 70s had been rough on America, and when Carter won in 1976, he inherited a very troubled country. Quite frankly, Carter gets a lot of criticism for his failed administration, but it's highly questionable whether anyone would have done much better considering the problems we faced at that point. The economy was a wreck. Inflation was high. Gas prices were outrageous. There was division in the country that had been caused by the Watergate scandal and also by Carter pardoning draft dodgers. Our war in Vietnam had ended in failure. And right before the election, we had seen Afghanistan overrun by the Russians, and America was too weak to do anything about it. And then Iran. The Ayatollah was overthrown, and then the American embassy was stormed, and Americans were being held hostage, and we seemed unable to do it. The world seemed to look at America as weak and faltering. Reagan is going to win the Republican nomination, and his campaign promise is to make America great again. That was originally his campaign slogan. We'll see it copied later on by Donald Trump in 2016. Reagan promises to make America great again at a time when America was at a low point. The 70s were a rough time. Things had been going poor, and he says, I'm going to make America great. I'm going to fix the economy. And I am going to make us strong again against the communists because they are a real threat. We've got to build up our military. We've got to be strong. So Reagan's going to use fear of communism. He's going to use the troubled economy. And he's going to have one more ally to help him win his presidential bid. There's been, since the 1960s, since we've seen traditional American values being challenged, and throughout the 70s, the challenge to our traditional values had continued, and we've seen all kinds of changes in our behavior and our attitudes, and a lot of Americans were looking back to our old moral values, and the evangelical movement within Christianity throughout the 1970s, and as we move into the 80s, is growing, and we're starting to see with cable television a lot of television preachers that are starting to be able to get their voice out there, and some of them are becoming very political in what they have to say. And he sees in the conservative Christian movement a possible powerful ally for the Republican Party. That issue we talked about in the 70s, Roe versus Wade, this ruling that had made abortion legal, is going to become a powerful tool for the Republicans moving forward as they take up the standard of pro-life. And Reagan's going to promise, hey, I'm going to stand for the moral, traditional values that conservative Christians believe in. He is going to reach out to them and convince them that the Republican Party is their party. It stands for their moral values. And that's going to be a powerful tool for Republicans right up until this very day. It's one of the things that is used to try to win over voters. And Reagan does this well. He puts together conservative economic capitalists with moral voting Christians and with people who are afraid of the communist threat, and he builds a strong base to help him get elected with the goal of making America great again in the way that these groups see America should be. So, as he becomes president, during the 1980s, Reagan is going to try to address all these issues. First of all, there's the economy. Now, what Reagan does is absolutely nothing new. It's the exact same Republican policy that we've seen since the Civil War. But it's rebranded now, trotted out there as supply-side economics or trickle-down economics. This is how it works. We've been seeing this from the Republicans for a long time. We still see it today. The theory is that what you're going to do is increase supply. You want to increase products. And what does that do? It's going to lower prices. So the idea is, first of all, you're going to cut taxes to the businesses and to the rich. Let them have their money, because what they're going to want to do is make more money. And they're going to invest it by expanding production. That means there's going to be more jobs. That means there's going to be more stuff being made, which will drive down the prices. Plus, all those people who now have jobs, they're going to be able to spend more money and buy these cheaper goods. And as these businesses sell more goods, they'll expand, make money, and they'll expand even more, creating more jobs, creating more supply, and driving down prices. And the idea is the wealth that we are cutting the taxes for the rich and for the businesses, it will trickle down to the middle class and the lower classes as they get jobs and they get cheaper goods. This is the same policy Republicans have been doing since the Civil War, and they still do. Does it work? Well, at times in America, it seems to work very well. At other times in America, well, it doesn't work so well because the investments get out of balance. And we end up with things like the stock market crash or the Great Recession of the early 2000s, where the banks and the loan companies start making ridiculous loans and over-investing in something. So it's not perfect. Sometimes it seems to work, sometimes it does not. And there's economists with theories both ways. Does Reagan fix the economy in the 80s? There are those who will tell you he did fix the economy. There are others who will tell you that the economy, it was just kind of the business cycle and it got better because it had to get better at some point. So there's even division today among historians and economic experts over whether Reagan actually did fix the economy. But to us living through the 1980s, the economy started getting better. And the majority of Americans, based on the number of people who vote for Reagan in 1984, believed Reagan was the cause of it. Reagan in 1984 will win by an overwhelming majority because, one, the economy seems to be getting better. He seems to be fixing it. Now, the one area Reagan's not going to cut big government spending is in the military, because Reagan's going to make us strong against the communists. That's what he promised to do. And so Reagan starts spending like crazy on the military. Carter had cut it, and the country looked weak. Reagan wants us to be strong. So he has a $2 trillion defense budget. We're making more and more nukes. We're making more and more missile systems. We're coming up with this idea called the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, where we're going to create a missile net in space with satellites that have lasers that shoot down incoming missiles, or send sound waves that interfere with incoming missiles, or use some other way to destroy incoming missiles. We never created it. It was way too expensive and technologically really impossible at the time. But it was frightening to the world. What if the U.S. did have a missile net? We could nuke others, but people couldn't nuke us. And it was scary to the Soviets. So when we start spending money like crazy to create this missile net in space, the Soviets have got to catch up. They've got to spend too. And that's the bottom line with the Reagan's approach to the Cold War. Reagan's going to make the Cold War now not so much about the military, but about the communist economy versus the capitalist economy. He's going to outspend the Russians. We're going to spend like crazy, and our capitalist economy will be able to handle it, at least in the short term. We'll be able to handle spending like crazy. The communist economy, however, was already under great strain. It had never been good. During the 70s, communist economies in the communist world were really being stretched. And for the military to need to keep up with us in an arms race in the 1980s was near impossible, but they're going to try. And ultimately, some people credit Reagan's spending with helping to bring an end to the Soviet Union. that will be part of the picture. Now, in addition to all of this, Reagan is going to have America stand up against aggression. First of all, we're going to stand up against the communists. Over in Afghanistan, where the Mujahideen are fighting to defeat communism, we're going to send those Muslim freedom fighters weapons. And we're going to supply them so they can carry on the fight against our enemy, communism. Now, ultimately, some of those people we're supplying down the road will become the Taliban, will become Al-Qaeda. But for the moment, these people are the enemy of communists, and we will help them. We will supply them. And they will be glad to take our aid. So we're going to stand up to communism there, supplying the enemies of communism. Over in El Salvador, down in Central America, we're going to supply the government there that's fighting against communist rebels. And the Congress will approve that. But over in Nicaragua in Central America, our Democrats in Congress don't want to try to topple that government because they believe we're interfering with a legally elected government there. But Reagan feels like it's a communist government and we've got to bring them down, so we want to support this rebel group there called the Contras. And he wants money to help the Contras overthrow this communist government. But the Congress, who controls the purse strings, said no. But we're going to see a little workaround a little bit later where we're going to end up supporting the Contras. And then the big one. It's tiny, but it's big. Just off the coast of South America is this itty bitty little island called Grenada. It's not much, but this little tiny island had a government that was communist. And in the midst of all that, with this change in government, Reagan sees this as a chance for the United States to flex its muscle against communism. We had American students down there in that country going to medical school, and those students in that little island nation were threatened by these upheavals, and so the United States, to protect our citizens, intervenes. And we sent in an invasion force and took that island over. It only took a few hours. It wasn't a big military objective, but it was a big step for us because we had not done anything aggressively against communism since losing in Vietnam. And here we were standing up to communism, and America really reacted to this. We were proud of this. This was a great moment where we had stood up to communists. And the idea was now we're not going to be backing down from them anymore. We're going to be standing up and pushing back against communism. So Reagan seems to be doing what he's promised. We're also going to have to deal with terrorists. As terrorism ramps up, we're seeing more and more planes and even ships where people are taken hostage. And we're seeing terrorist bombings. And so when some of these people are taken hostage, our official policy is you don't negotiate with terrorists, because if you give them what they want, then they'll just take more hostages to get more of what they want. So you don't negotiate with them. And so America's standing up against these terrorists. And when coming out of a little country called Libya, their leader, Muammar Gaddafi, supported terrorists who were training in his country. The United States bombed Libya as retaliation for them supporting terrorists who were committing these terrorist acts. And so America was standing up tough against terrorists. But as we're going to see, there's going to be some conflict of interest a little later in the Reagan administration. Now, the big thing that we remember from the Reagan era is the beginning of the fall of the Soviet Union. And it's not just Reagan putting the pressure on them, but it's also what's happening in the Soviet Union that's going to bring that around. And this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev, is going to be a big part of bringing an end to communism. He will become the new General Secretary of the Communist Party and lead the Soviet Union. But he realizes their economy is faltering, their country is under great strain. And so he institutes some new policies. Glasnost, a new openness. No longer is there going to be as much repression and government restriction. They're going to start to let people have more rights, more freedoms. The people are going to have more of a voice to speak out against the government and to voice their concerns and their complaints. They're going to have more freedom of movement and travel. They're going to have, in perestroika, more freedom to do business with the capitalist West. And they're going to invite Western businesses into the Soviet Union to start to invest there. They're undoing communism already. But the Communist Party's still trying to hold on to that country and keep it primarily communist. But this new openness is kind of a response to what Reagan's been doing. He's been putting pressure on them. And Reagan goes to Berlin and gives a famous speech at the Berlin Wall where he tells Mr. Gorbachev, if you're serious about these changes, come to this wall, tear down this wall. And as the world sees the Soviets somewhat relaxing their position, the power of the Communist Party, over in Eastern Europe, we start to see in Germany and in Poland and other Eastern European countries a movement of people protesting communist control. And we will eventually see communism come to an end. Now, in 1984, Reagan ran for election once again, and he won in a landslide. People believed he was fixing the economy. People believed he was making America strong again. But in his second term of office, with everything seeming to be going his way, there was a scandal. The Iran-Contra scandal comes about over in Iran. We don't like them. They had taken Americans hostage. Now, they had released the hostages right after Reagan became president, but we have some bad blood with the Iranians. And we don't trust them, and they don't trust us. And they support terrorists, and they're friends with terrorists. And we don't negotiate with terrorists, but terrorists have some Americans hostage. And Iran was fighting a long, bloody war during the 80s with their next-door neighbor, Iraq. And they needed weapons. So what happened behind closed doors, secretly, is the Iranians and the Americans started negotiating, and the Iranians said, look, we can get your hostages released if you guys will sell us weapons to fight our war. They don't like us, we don't like them, but we're going to make this deal of convenience. So we sell them weapons. They help get our hostages released, and this is all secret. And now we got this pile of money from where we sold them weapons, and it's secret money the Congress doesn't know about. And so the Reagan administration, whether Reagan himself knew about this or not, there's no proof that he did. It's very possible that people below Reagan's level were the ones actually engineering this, but it clearly followed Reagan's desired policies. We're going to take this money that Congress doesn't know about, and we're going to give it to the Contras in Nicaragua to fight against the communist government there. Now, this whole thing is illegal, but we did it, and then we got caught. And when it comes out that the Reagan administration has been doing this dirty deal and violating our principles about negotiating with terrorists and breaking the law by using this money without Congress's permission to support these anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua, well, there had to be an investigation. And although Reagan said, I take responsibility because it's my administration, he never said he knew about it or admitted to having personally approved this thing. So whether he did or not, we just don't know. But there were plenty of guys well below his level that were willing to take the fall for him, most notably Oliver North. Oliver North, a colonel in the Marines, testifies and admits to this operation and admits to shredding evidence. And he kind of takes the fall for this operation, allowing people far above his pay grade that probably were involved to avoid being incriminated. Well, even though this was a scandal, Reagan's popularity remained high. If he could have run for another term as president in 1988, he would have won. Reagan stayed popular even with scandal. In 1988, Reagan can't run for a third term. So instead, his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, the youngest fighter pilot from World War II, so he's a military hero, and he had become rich in the oil business in Texas and then become a politician. He is going to represent the Republicans. Now, he had actually been more of a political moderate. Reagan was more conservative, so he had kind of balanced the ticket. But now he's moved more towards Reagan's positions on most things, and he promises to lead us, continuing on in the pattern of what Reagan had been doing. And during the presidential election, he talks about some important things. It looked like communism was starting to collapse, and he starts talking about we're entering a new era. The Cold War is drawing to a close, and we're about to see a new world order. It'll no longer be the communists versus the free world. Instead, we're going to see a change in the order of nations. And he also makes promises, like during one debate, saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And he makes that promise, which will come back to bite him. His opponents, well, to show you just how strong the religious right has become, in the Republican campaign for the nomination, Pat Robertson, a television evangelist, he actually made a very strong showing. Now, ultimately, Bush won the nomination, but just shows you that religious right was at its high point in the late 1980s. And as a counterpoint to that, the leading Democratic candidate, Gary Hart, had this lovely picture taken of him, where a girl, not his wife, was sitting on his lap on a boat called the Monkey Business. And the implication that he was having an affair wrecked his political campaign because, again, the moral conservative movement is at its height, and for a candidate to be cheating on his wife publicly is going to be scandalous, and he dropped out of the race. Instead, the guy who got the nomination was Michael Dukakis. But ultimately, Bush is going to win the nomination, and he's going to lead us on into the 1990s. Now, during the campaign, we mentioned he promised no new taxes, and he meant it. But things are going to change and force him to make a decision to change that promise. He's talked about that new world order as communism begins to collapse, and we're going to see it happen very rapidly after he takes office. He also mentions this 1,000 points of light that across the country, we need less big government. That's what Reagan had been in favor of. But yes, there are people who are in need, people who are in poverty, people who need someone to help them. So that's going to be local community organizations, charities, churches, civic groups. They are the 1,000 points of light which can make the difference and meet the needs of the people, not big government. So these are the promises we see from Bush as we are moving into the 1990s. Almost as soon as Bush takes office, we're going to see the Cold War truly come to an end. In 1989, as Russia was starting to ease restrictions, we started to see across Eastern Europe, in Eastern Germany and Poland, groups rising up demanding more rights, demanding change. In Poland, you see the Solidarity Group challenging and eventually defeating the communists in elections. And Russia allows it to happen. And in Eastern Germany, throughout Germany, you see people calling to tear down the Berlin Wall and to open and reunite Germany. And the Russians, at this point, they've become weak. The Communist Party allows it to happen. And so in 1989, finally, Germany agrees to open the borders. And the people take it upon themselves to come over the wall and tear down the Berlin Wall. and people take sledgehammers to it in November of 1989, and they destroy that wall that had divided them. So we're seeing across Europe, as the 80s come to a close, communism is starting to fall. And one by one, the Eastern communist countries of Europe get rid of their communist governments. And so in the Soviet Union, we're seeing communism on the verge of collapse. And so as we enter the 1990s, during the Bush administration, we're going to see truly a new world order.